Rise of the Deadman. Chapter 2. James Realms. His mind woke quickly, but his eyes wanted to stay shut as the tune on his phone continued. Higher Ground was shrilled right into his ears, the phone on full volume, and while Stevie Wonder's voice didn't kick in before James could hit the snooze button, he didn't mind the silence that filled his shrunken, inadequate bedroom after his hand returned under his pillow. He was back asleep before he knew it, only to be awoken again 15 minutes later by the same song. While he wasn't in as deep a sleep as before, his hand found his phone much quicker this time, and more violently slammed onto the glass over the snooze button once again. This process would continue for another hour and a half, at 30-minute increments going forward, until the clock on the phone read 7:30. When the final alarm went off, and James let Stevie finally hit his opening word, only to abruptly cut him off, he slid the top cover off of him and continued to lie on his bed, eyes now wide open, thinking about this moment. As was a regular occurrence by now, this would be the most peaceful, relaxing, and enjoyable part of his day. After another couple minutes of heaven, he pulled the last cover and bedsheet away from him, allowing his body to be exposed to the cold apartment room air. Again, as happened every day, he immediately regretted this decision and pulled everything back over him once again for a brief period to warm back up. James Realms finally did leave his bed another minute later to look into the dirty, stained mirror only to see his reflection. A defeated 20-year-old with hardly any money and no real space to live in. Just a bed, a small kitchen, a few windows, a tiny bathroom, and a doorway that led to a mundane outside world. To describe James Realms is an easy task. He was a fairly in-shape young man with light brown hair, a fair complexion, and nice, light green eyes. He had no muscle, and does not work out. Not to say he was out of shape, but he could work on it, if only he had the inclination. He wore boxers to bed, nothing else, and his legs were not very long or strong. If anything, he could run a little ways, otherwise he had no outstanding physical abilities. James worked at a small department store, Graney's, as a bagger. He worked for about $7.50 an hour and only worked for about 8 hours, so $60 a day before taxes. That wasn't enough for one tank of gas these days, but 60 was better than 45, which is what he had from being a janitor at the age of 15. Back in those days, his academics were important to him, but he could never do well. He was just a kid that no one cared about or showed any special interest in. He could barely drive, had little money, and no allowance. His parents went away every summer for months at a time. While they were away, he mostly lived off his nicer neighbors and few school friends, but all of those friends had gone on to college. James had not. He didn't excel in high school. He did graduate, but with 4 D's and 2 C's. He almost failed chemistry, calculus, history, and Spanish. He did a little better at English and computer techniques. His ultimate goal was to be able to get a job that paid well and get him out of the small, deadbeat town of Aberdeen, Ohio. But as long as he was working at Graney's, this ultimate dream was pretty far off. So, as he did with most other goals in life, he put it aside. Instead, he set his sights on another goal, moving out of his parents' house, which he had accomplished 2 years before. Well, more or less accomplished. His parents had been furious with his decision to not enroll into university, like both of them had. They gave him the ultimatum of signing up for college or getting a job that would pay enough to get him an apartment. That's where Graney's came in. He honestly didn't mind if he kept working as a bagger for the rest of his life, as long as he wasn't living with his parents, since that would keep him out of college, where he knew he wouldn't belong, and he stood a better chance of landing a girlfriend. But at the rate things were going, being single was the least of his problems, but to him it was the top item on his wish list. When the ultimatum was handed down, he quit the janitor post and found this new job as a cashier at Graney's, only to discover it would be temporary. He would have had to find something else, but fortunately for him, an old bastard that had worked there for nearly 70 years finally croaked, leaving a vacant bagger position for him to fill. James could see himself as the old man one day, keeling over on the job as his predecessor did. It was far from a life he desired, but it would just have to be the life he settled for. James stepped away from the mirror, yawning the sleep out of his system. He walked toward his shower and started the hot water running. He thought about quitting his job, going to college if his parents would give him the money, and how he would tell off his boss during a 15-minute shower. As was customary for him, he had his clothes gathered in one corner of the bathroom so he could dress after he had toweled off. After all his work attire was on, he couldn't think of a subject he could major in that would keep him going through the slog of college, or a snappy way to announce his departure from the world-famous Graney's department store. So he decided to just keep doing what he was doing. He couldn't shake off the feeling of judgment that kids fresh out of high school would have against him, as they all sat in the same class. Here would be this 20-year-old sitting with 18 and 19-year-olds who would never let him forget the age gap, small as it was, between them. This was a problem that neither of his parents had had when they were going to school. His father, Roger, had worked at a firm across town for about 30 years, Brigsby & Brigsby, specializing in insurance laws and practices. He had started as a mailroom runner in high school. After graduating, Roger had advanced as a humbled intern, no pay, but he planted his feet there. Through further education and associates retiring or moving away, Roger soon found himself in the top 10% and secure in his position, and so he had stayed until a couple years ago when he retired at 58. He still had over $1 million in his bank account and had a nice home with his wife Pam, James's mother. She, meanwhile, was a stay-at-home mom while James was in school and filled her hours with the standard cooking and cleaning. It was better than what was originally planned for her. Pam Relms had graduated college summa cum laude from Ohio State University, a 2-hour drive from Aberdeen. Roger had also graduated there, but both knew each other from Aberdeen and grew up 3 blocks from each other. While they never dated in high school or showed much interest in each other, they both came from the small town of 1,550. Funny enough, the two had been rivals in elementary school, fighting over who had the playground rights. She had grown out of that and studied financial trading in college and got pretty damn good at it. In fact, too good. Less than 3 months on the trading floors of Wall Street, she had moved back to Aberdeen, realizing that the mechanical mode her mind went into was draining her humanity. The move had momentarily broken up her relationship with Roger as well, but all was forgiven the moment she came home with her tail between her legs. Roger proposed to her 2 months after she got back, and they married less than a year later. And after many tries and many years, along came James, when Roger was 39 and Pam was 38. Her pregnancy had been a tough one, and suffice it to say the doctors had encouraged Pam to stop at 1 child. While she was very happy with James, it pained Pam to know that he wouldn't have a little brother or sister around the house to play with. Even with raising James, Pam was very active with church, clubs, and shopping. When Roger was working his way up the ladder at the firm, though, and money was tight, she had worked as a receptionist at a chiropractor's office. She had the option to work at the biggest bank in town, but her bad experience back east had put that idea out of her mind. Roger, in the meantime, had worked his way to junior associate, handling medium-sized clients from neighboring towns like Ellsbury and Slickaway. While Aberdeen was known for being an agricultural town, none of the surrounding places had much financial protection. So the founders of the firm, Harold and Thomas Brigsby, had taken it upon themselves to insure the big businesses in Aberdeen and the other towns near the Kentucky border, and soon became one of the businesses that kept the small town running. Roger's big break came about 5 years after James was born. The big boss at the firm, a descendant of the original owners by the name of Eleanor Brigsby, had been charged with fraud, and the board let her go as consequence, even after the charges, which were false, were dropped. Roger's most trusted co-worker, Lenny Walston, became the new boss and promoted Roger further up the company ladder. As it had happened, Roger was about to progress to an executive level, but then he was assistant manager before his ass could fill his new, more comfortable and expensive office chair. As James thought about all of this, seeing how some skill and a bit of luck advanced his father's career, and how conscience had kept his mother in good standing, he felt hopeful that maybe one day, with the few skills he had, he could become a success too. But it would be hard to do so as a bagger at Graney's department store. James left every morning at about 7:50, so he could arrive at 7:57 or so, check in, and get ready for the day. For now, he had to walk everywhere he went, which wasn't too bad since work was only about 4 blocks away, and his folks were down the street 2 blocks. This was all because his car had quit 3 days after starting at Graney's. It was an old 1996 Chrysler Concorde, painted green. He had bought it with his own money for $700, with just over 125,000 miles on it. It got him from A to B, but then the solenoid and the head gasket went out. And with those parts never going for an affordable price, the Concorde sat at the local repair shop. The owner, Carl, had a daughter who graduated with James, and was friendly enough to say it could sit there as long as needed. But it had been almost 2 years now, and James had a fear each morning that today would be the day Carl would give him a call, ordering him to move it. Today, a boring and sunless Thursday, he walked in at 8:21, greeted by upset looks from his supervisor Delilah, who told him he had just lost his lunch hour so he could make up for his tardiness. Work went by particularly slow that day. Not only were there few customers with small purchases, none of them would even smile at him. He matched the demeanor of every customer that shortly glanced at him. The only good news came from Delilah at 3:30, when she said her son was coming home from college tonight, and that he really wanted some money that he could needlessly spend a week later when he went back. That meant James could take the next day off and work the morning shift on Saturday, only 8 to 12. Finally, when 5 o'clock came around, James Relms was more than ready to go. He turned the open sign to closed, and told Delilah he'd close the rest of the store. No one had come in for the last 3 hours, and she was fine with it. After shutting off the lights, checking the aisles to make sure no one had snuck in, and using the bathroom, he walked down the hallway that connected the main store and the main offices, and walked out the door. He locked it behind him and started for home, down the sidewalk. A cold, lifeless sidewalk. His life had become that sidewalk. He had no social life, what few consider a home worth living in, and a couple of friends that hadn't prospered from high school graduation or been taken by drugs or alcohol. Even the friends he did have hadn't called him up for weeks. No plans for this Thursday night. So, with the wind in his face and more clouds moving in, he walked home, silent. Then the rain began to fall. He started running as it picked up. Right about then, the thunder rumbled and the wind picked up even more so. As the concrete became wetter and slicker, the inevitable feeling of slipping and falling onto the wet sidewalk came over him. He knew, sooner or later, he would look a most embarrassing sight for any poor souls he passed by, or those curious enough to look his way as they drove on. Nevertheless, he made it home, wet, but safe and sound. James went in, closed the door behind him, and slunk into a chair in his poor excuse of a living room. He defiantly doubted that he would ever leave this place. Jobs he was qualified for were few and far between, and he had no experience to build a new career on. He kept thinking about what his father had said to him after he had graduated. Something along the lines of, "You don't have to go to college, but you'll miss out on more than the party society. You'll miss out on a life you were meant to have." Those words haunted James, dug into his brain, and wouldn't leave. He had many times thought about taking as much money as he could save back and moving to the nearest big city, Cincinnati, only an hour and 10 minutes away. He didn't know too many people there, and his parents had taken him during some day trips in the past. It seemed like a nice enough place, but he was sure the rent would be too high for a person as unqualified as he was for most of the jobs in the big city. Putting all of that out of his mind, James decided to turn on his old TV set, not surprised to find that in the wrap-up of the local news that his mood matched that of the country. The buffoon of a president had vetoed something or other, the Dow was down 49 points, and a school bus had crashed, sending 12 kids to the hospital and 4 to the morgue in some small town in Iowa. Before depression could settle in any more comfortably, James shut off the damn thing and went to bed. He took off his slightly wet work pants and drenched shoes, kept his mostly dry t-shirt on, and slipped under the covers. He wasn't planning on sleeping, but it came to him anyways. His dreamless sleep went on for about 5 hours. He had left his door open, and could see from an open window in his TV room that the sky was as gray and dark as it had been all day. But as he woke up, it was all black. Only a small light from his oven crept across his apartment and into his bedroom. He went back into the TV room and tried turning on the TV to something more pleasant than the news. He was mistaken. Here, gleaming before him, was the face of a Billy Mays knockoff, trying to sell him a set of knives that could do anything. The pestering man kept repeating that over and over again. Anything, anything, anything. They could work as a key if you were locked out of the house. You could cut through a metal pipe if you wanted to. Before he could see what else the knives could do, James violently turned the TV off and tossed the remote across the room. The remote crashed against the far wall, and from that sound reverberating off the walls, the damage was assessed to the back of it coming off and the batteries rolling away from their home. He could care less. James returned to his room and plugged his phone in. He had let it lie when he took his unexpected nap. It wasn't until now that he realized he still had his work shirt on, a red granny's tunic. After changing into a white t-shirt and lounge pants, he returned under the covers and played games and watched YouTube videos until his eyes became heavy. By that time it was well past 3 in the morning. While he had nothing to do the next day, he figured this was a sign that he should hit the hay. As became a ceremonial moment before catching his Z's every night, he picked out what song on his phone would wake him up the next morning. He set the alarm for 10, which should be long enough to sleep in till. With his phone plugged in and Queen's Radio Gaga ready to wake him up the next morning, a single alarm at 10 a.m., he returned to sleep. The phone rang twice before he woke up. He glanced at the caller ID, wide awake, and saw it was his father, whom he had entered into his phone heartlessly as Roger Relms. It was 9:03, so he still had an hour before Freddie and his boys would properly wake him. This added to his decision not to answer. He didn't really feel like talking to his father, either, so he let it go to voicemail and closed his eyes once again. While he didn't really care about what his father had to say to him or what he wanted to talk about, he couldn't quite fall back asleep. His curiosity got the better of him, and he opened up his mailbox to hear a message left by his father. "Hey, it's Dad. Just wanted to talk to you and ask what you were doing. I know you're at work, so I'll try to keep it short. We haven't seen you since Father's Day, so your mother and I were thinking we'd like to invite you over for dinner. So call back and tell us if you're able to come. I think we're going to get started around 7. Hope to see you there. And son, it'll be nice to see you." The ending made James feel a little guilty. When he was growing up, his busy parents were his best friends. Still, the way he was raised was different than most of his classmates. Roger was pushing 40 when he was conceived, where most kids had parents who had them when they were fresh out of college, so playing catch was often short-lived, because all of the time at desks at Brigsby and Brigsby cursed Roger with a sore back. Pam, however, was always there for him, attending any school concerts he was involved in, picking up the drop ball when Roger had to go back in, and always was in the mood to bake chocolate chip cookies and pour out some milk, set it up for her son, and have a nice chat with him. She, more than Roger, was the parent that James could always talk to and confide in, until the wonders of puberty took effect, and he felt estranged from the perfect parents. Several conversations ended with him yelling the all-too-familiar words, "I wish you were dead!" followed by the slamming of a door. By the time James graduated, he felt his father had lost interest in him, and was more thinking of how he'd spend his retirement, but Mom was as supportive as ever. But with one came the other, and whenever a conversation was struck up between James and his mother, Dad had to step in and criticize. Then he had come up with the ultimatum of getting that job or going to school, which further squandered James and Roger's relationship. Since then, visits had been infrequent. Even holidays were skipped from time to time. And now his father wanted to talk. What could his father, a retired chap, want to talk to him about? Curiosity still driving him, he decided to call back. The phone rang several times, but no answer. Weird. His father had just called a moment ago, but now there wasn't anybody there to pick up. Roger never did answer, so James left a message. "Hey, Dad. Yeah, dinner sounds nice. Yeah, I'll be there at 6:30 or so, maybe a little earlier. Depends. All right, see you later. Bye-bye." He put his phone back down and went straight into the bathroom. He took a 10-minute shower, thinking over what would happen next. Forgetting that he had set the alarm, by this point the opening beats to Radio Gaga filled his bathroom as he finished brushing his teeth. He shut it off, and his thinking mind continued where he left off in the shower, tossing and turning over what the hell he could do all day to pass the time. The TV was out, since everything he saw in there was trash. Maybe he could walk the 5 blocks to the library and pick out a couple of books. Then it struck him. He went back into his bedroom to a small desk in the corner, and opened the top drawer. He found his doodle book, mixed in with a roll of old Scotch tape, a few pencils almost completely worn down, and an old, rusted pocket watch that supposedly had belonged to a great-great-grandfather. What felt like a few minutes turned out to be a few hours. James took a lot of pride looking back through the doodles that filled his middle and high school days. No wonder he hadn't done so well with grades. He was too busy drawing up dragons and other made-up mythological creatures. The final sketch in the book was an unfinished one. He had to think about it real hard before he could remember what it was supposed to be. Then he remembered. It was a large meadow, where an old man was standing. Was it God looking over his creation of earth? Or an old shepherd returning to derelict farm ground? Now it could be whatever he wanted. For the first time in recent memory, he could be creative. He picked up one of the old pencils, the one with the most lead left on it, and got to work. He flipped back through his older works and decided what he would do. This old man would be the caretaker of all these creatures he had created in the earlier sketches and doodles. He could be the doodle wrangler. All the doodles would live in peace in this little patch of meadow heaven, forever on display for whomever would pick up the doodle book. When he had finished, James stared back at his work for a long time. While everyone is their own worst critic, he couldn't shake the feeling that even though he put a lot of work and effort into the piece, it wasn't worth anything. Not even the paper it had been drawn onto. His mind flashed the idea of ripping the page out of the book, crumpling it and throwing it away. But James stopped himself from doing that. He decided to put the doodle book back where he found it, put the pencil on top of it, and shut the drawer. Looking at the clock on his phone, he saw that he had about 2 hours before he had to leave to meet his parents. He opened a couple of his favorite apps on his phone and played for a while. Then he went back to his usual comfort, YouTube, until 5:45. He walked over to his pitiful excuse of a closet and picked out some neater clothes. He decided not to go the suit and tie route, and instead to wear a nice shirt with one set of jeans that did not have any stylish holes in them. With his parents about 10 minutes away, he left a little earlier than 6:30 and arrived 12 minutes later. Like yesterday, the gray clouds were out in force again, but now they were starting not to matter as much. The sun was going down, and it'd be dark soon enough. Staring at the clouds and noticing everything around his old neighborhood was his excuse for reaching the residence of Pam and Roger Relms 2 minutes later than usual. As he reached his parents' house, James rang the doorbell a couple of times, but his eyes were looking around once more. He took this moment to think about Tommy Shaven, his old next-door neighbor. He was in James's class, and was always talking about the latest comic or computer game. James never went in for that kind of stuff, preferring instead movies or TV, and older music, which was primarily what he had on his phone to wake him up each morning. Sure, he might as well say he was a nerd, but the comic and computer nerd, that was an orange, if he was an apple. Tommy and he had still been friends, though, until junior year, when he became a know-it-all who couldn't help but brag about his ACT scores and wide college acceptability. James had tanked on the tests, and would have been lucky to see any acceptance from a post-high school institution. Strange. All this time to think about the past, and no one had answered the door. He turned his head to see the yard, where he and the parents used to run through the sprinkler or play kickball in the early years of James's childhood, when Dad's back wasn't giving him problems. The bushes underneath the first-story windows were as perfectly trimmed as ever. Throughout the yard, weeds were extinct. The stereotypical white picket fence was still there, too. It was your average suburban house plucked out of its natural habitat, resting instead in a farm town. A perfect yard, perfect shrubbery, and a well-kept paint job. When retirement came around, Roger and Pam could probably sell it for upwards of $375,000. Thank God that was more than what they bought it for. Still no answer at the door. James was getting impatient.